We're the book friends that think good.
What does this mean for our life, for our world? Yiggity yeet, my dude. I'm happy to speak. Always happy to think.
I don't know how to do that. I can look into that.
Makes you sound like a book friend that can think good.
It's Jack and it's Weston.
BFTTGs. Yeah.
Jack, I think good. Sometimes I good think, too.
Makes you sound pretty good.
We might want to make it more concise. We are going to attempt to grapple and answer 3 questions. Number 1, what did we learn? Number 2, what did we disagree with? And number 3, what are we going to do about it? I am ready to roll.
I'm in it. Weston, my book friend, tell me, what book is it that we're thinking good about today?
All right, so today we are talking about chapters 2 and 3 in Atomic Habits by James Clear. Chapter 2 is titled How Your Habits Shape Your Identity and Vice Versa. And so we'll start there. Jack, what did you learn, or what stood out early on in this chapter?
Well, I want to start off by saying last week we talked about goalless living, right? Living without goals. And I did that. I felt great this week. I also missed all my deadlines, so it's a learning process. Be kind with yourself. I got super behind in my work, living all goalless. But I did feel good. I felt good, pressing into that and thinking about, how am I living? What are my processes like? My processes, unfortunately, didn't include productivity just yet. First thing that stood out, obviously, the diagrams on page 30, 31 about the layers of behavioral change. So you have outcome-based habits and you have identity-based habits. Basically, Clear breaks it down as like habits are formed in 3 layers in ourselves. There's like the core, which is our identity. There's the process, or what we do, and then there's the outcome, so the goal that we see. And he makes argument in this chapter like that most of our goals are outcome-oriented. They're all about the results that we see, and thus our process for habit change goes in that direction. It goes from outcomes through process to identity. And I really liked his point about I think his quote here is the reason we don't change our habits is because we try to change the wrong thing, or we try to change in the wrong direction through this layer of identity. And I think that's really a great observation. He makes the analogy of like weight loss, for instance, right? Like I want to lose 10 pounds. So you say, okay, well, I want to lose 10 pounds. I'm going to start going to the gym. And then maybe I'll be a healthy person if I do that. But then he gives an example in this chapter of a woman who he knows who lost 100 pounds. And the way that she did it is by saying, what would a healthy person do? Then she oriented her behaviors around that guiding question as a daily ritual and started to make healthy choices, and eventually just shed weight because she was living an identity that allowed her to see the outcomes that she wanted, not the other way around. To me, that was great. Like, I tried out goalless living this week, right? And I didn't accomplish any of my deadlines. I got like super behind in my work. This was something we talked about last week, but I hadn't read ahead to this to understand that, well, I wanted to be living this like goalless life. I wanted the freedom that James Clear talks about, but I didn't work on my processes. And more importantly, I wasn't at this core thinking like, oh, I want to be the kind of person who just accomplishes the things I would accomplish, regardless of deadlines, or the kind of person who can live a lifestyle that doesn't need goals because they're just accomplishing tasks. Like I hadn't made that identity shift. I was still thinking like, oh, maybe I'll try goalless living, and then that will affect my processes, which will change my identity into a person who doesn't need goals, right? And I think that's just like I instantly saw in myself, like, oh, I want to immediately apply this stuff, and I needed to work on my identity and like let it flow out from there. So that was kind of a learning for me. I was looking at it and going, oh, okay. If I want to take on some of the things he's talking about here about 1% gains and improvements, I need to start at a heart level from the inside out.
As the famous philosopher J. Cole once said, real change starts from the inside. I completely agree. This was my first note
That's
too,
right.
talking about how the habits are built in layers. Like I never considered that they were built in layers like that, but I have used them exactly the way that he has described. So again, this was another thing that I was like, oh, this is something that I've done that I just didn't have like a name for, but I'm doing it. So it was kind of a validating feeling for me as well, because excuse me, when he was talking about the woman who lost weight, that was like exactly what I did. So I didn't lose that much weight, but at one point I was about, I don't know, 180, a little bit over that, and I ended up losing about 30 pounds to where I am now, and I saw more success once I shifted my mindset. This is a few years ago now. Once I shifted my mindset from being I want to lose a certain weight and focusing on the weight as the outcome to I want to change my processes and my habits and what I'm doing. So I think that's a very useful idea in terms of think about what you're doing and not what you want to get to, because what you're doing is what's going to get you to the end result. But if you're, it's kind of like it's similar to me. I kept visualizing throughout this part of the book, a watched pot never boils, right? Like if you're constantly looking
Yeah.
up there at whatever you're trying to get to, you're not going to do the things that are going to help you get there, or losing the forest for the trees, things like that. Like I kept thinking about stuff like that, where it's like, yeah, it's really about the process and learning to love the process, learning to enjoy just the little processes of things, and not getting so wrapped up in where you want to be, because I just think that's a very mentally damaging thing. I brought it back to mental health a lot of times throughout this chapter too. Just like I think this is what a lot of young people need too, because again, I tend to think of these things in education frames, and there's a huge idea, very prevalent. It's what a lot of admin, big buzzword in education, begin with the end in mind. And I get that. Like as a teacher, I want to make sure I know where I want the students to go, or at least where I want them to start heading. Like there's certain things where it's like, yeah, I want the kids to be able to multiply 9 by 9. Know their multiplication facts. That's a very concrete goal. But you need to think about what are the processes that are going to actually get you there, right? Because the classic way of doing it, just rote memorization, is one, not fun, two, not engaging and stimulating mentally, so it doesn't create as strong pathways for memory that the kids will have, right? So yeah, it was just something else that I was thinking about just within the context of my job, in terms of like, I feel like I've made a big shift with this already, and this book is validating, and I want to continue to find different ways to focus on processes, not end results. Because again, those are the things that lead to mental health issues, and a big reason why I think so many of our youth are downtrodden and not in a great mental state is because they're constantly told this is where you need to be, and especially considering the context of the pandemic in the last 2 years, it's almost impossible to get there. So there's just been a lot of like failure put onto them that is not their fault. So
yeah, right. I mean, that's like the age-old question. That's like the age-old question in education at this point, and like the struggle is like standardized testing. Like, does it do more harm than good?
I don't think that's a question.
Because we're like, yeah,
ain't getting a hold of me.
Yeah, right. I mean, yeah, and I think that this is one of the problems of one of my favorite parables. I think that it's Soren Kierkegaard who talks about this, but it's a great like sort of modern parable for spirituality and like how the church sometimes functions. And I definitely see this, and push against this with people and encourage them to like get into daily practices rather than like milestone practices. Like, oh, maybe someday I'll pray more. Maybe someday I'll, help the needy. Maybe one day I will give money. Right now I don't, but like you build those habits with small incremental changes. And like if you say like, yeah, someday when I have more time, I'll help the poor, that will never come. Like you have to
Exactly.
start helping the poor now, or it's not going to be a habit that's built into your life. And Kierkegaard talks about this. He tells this story about a goose who is flamboyant, charismatic, attracts all of the other geese to his church in the swamp. This goose preacher, he can fly. Like he gets up behind the pulpit, spreads his wings. Every week he does a demonstration where he shows them what it's like to fly. And he says, it's so simple. All you do is stretch out your wings, you flap them, and you can fly. And the geese all waddle back to their homes in the swamp, and they go, man, that preacher, isn't that something? Can't you imagine if we could fly? And I just think, like, that's exactly the kind of lifestyle that Clear is advocating for, is one where you're not doing that to yourself. You're not putting yourself in this box where it's like, I could never do this. Because by believing that about yourself, you're automatically cutting yourself out.
Absolutely.
If you're living this way, where you're looking at yourself saying, I could never be that, or I could never do that, you're automatically cutting yourself out. Like, you got to give yourself the space, the grace in your identity to say, well, I can do these things. I am this kind of person. Believing it is what leads to behavioral change.
Yep. I completely agree. And that led to me talking about, or thinking about with this book, on page 33, when he's talking about intrinsic motivation, right? I said, I totally agree, and I think that's key. Like, being intrinsically motivated is key to having good health. And this page was just a great reminder to me to continue to, like, look inward. And I thought of the quote, "Be the change you want to see in the world," right? So just continue to learn and grow, and I'm not going to be able to change anything on the external world, anything that I have external, unless I change something about myself, whether it's my mindset, my habits, my processes, right? But you got to change yourself to effectively change, at the very least, how you view everything on the outside. So, and then you talked about a point of pushback, so I was wondering if we had the same one here, because it was on page 34 for me.
My pushback is a little bit later.
Oh, okay. So if we look at page 34, on this page he moves on to the idea that, or like making these processes a part of your identity, or making these goals a part of your identity, right? Not to read a book, but to become a reader. Not to run a marathon, but to become a runner. And my question, which was a slight pushback at first, was I just wonder if later on in the book he delves into the sinister side of making these things part of your identity, because in my experience, these sorts of identities can consume you, and then when you plateau or your lack of progress starts and you can't see any, it starts to create this vicious cycle of self-loathing and degradation of your own self-worth. So I'm just wondering if he gets into any of that. And I'm concerned he doesn't, because shortly after this part, again, just on the same page, he says, once you know all this, once you do this, doing the right thing is easy. And I have experienced the exact opposite of that in my entire life. I hard disagree with that statement, because, Jack, I mean, we've talked about this before, but when I was first learning about the history of the 7 greatest sins, 7 deadly sins, the 7 best sins.
Yeah.
No, the old one that was replaced by
our
sloth.
list next week on BFTTG.
Yeah. How to sin good was the one that stood out to me, that I think I've experienced the most in my life, or at least has been the most problematic for me personally, has been Acadia, or Acedia. I don't know. I've heard it pronounced either way. But it's the idea. It was replaced with sloth at some point. I don't remember exactly when, because this was a class I took 8 years ago. But
Yeah.
It's the idea that
Right.
you know the good, but you still don't do
Mm-hmm.
anything about it, right? Um,
Mm.
I consider myself a
Yeah.
strong Christian
I
and
mean,
a man of faith, right? But that does not make it easy to have
sure.
faith. And another example,
No.
it's so embedded in my tattoo that I have, or in my identity, that I have faith and that I know God, that I have a tattoo of it. But that does not make it easy to be a Christian and follow Christ,
Right.
right? The other thing, just simple, going back, maybe not as deep as
Yeah.
that, with the whole health thing and losing weight. Yes, I know eating this salad or eating less is going to be better for me. But does that make it easy for me to choose that?
Mm.
I don't think so. I'm still craving Oreos. I'm
Yeah.
still looking like, damn,
No, I
Oreos
mean,
sound pretty good. Like, I don't think that he is. I just wonder if he gets more into this later in the book in another chapter. But him just giving it at
yeah.
face value, saying, like, oh, yeah, once you know what's good, it's really easy to do the right thing. Nah,
Yeah.
that ain't real life.
No. Yeah. No, absolutely not. I mean, I look back to when I was a runner. And like, here's the other thing is that like your identity is fluid, and he does get into this a little bit. But like, there is such a problem with hanging our identity on action. Like, that was my bigger thing is like, okay, my identity is not just a subset of all of my doings, right? Like, oh, I'm a reader, I'm a accountant, I'm a, like, what would you call that? A mather, right? Like, what happens when those things are taken away? Like, does your identity just crumble into shambles and you have to like rebuild all the time when like you you're a runner. You've built your habits around this. It's core to your identity. Then you're hit by a bus while you're running. Like, your legs are taken away, whatever. Like, what happens to your identity then? And, like, I think that that is a big caution with this is, like, he makes the case a couple of times, like, your behaviors are the sum of your being. And I think, I just, like, push back on that a little bit where it's like, yeah, I mean, your behaviors make up a part of your being, but like there is an element to being that is outside of action. Like, not just about what you do. It's also about like who you are, and that there are elements of that that can't be taken away. That are things like, because we're talking about the spiritual side of it, like Son of God, like it's something that can't be taken away by, and there are behaviors that can build around that. But there are also things that, like for me, that is going to, influence lots of other behaviors. It's not like it has a to B correlation with something.
This just sparked this memory in my mind, but yeah, dude, this is real. Because for me, in high school, I identified as a football player. Like that was my whole identity. So when I lost that aspect of my life, I was lost. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to think. I didn't know who I was. And so, I mean, that honestly, that kind of sparked my whole path to becoming a philosophy and a theology guy. And then from there, I learned,
Yeah.
wow, I really do enjoy teaching and helping young people learn, right? So but like, dude, 16, 17, 18, 19, I mean, because you lived with me when we were 18, 19, like, dude, I was all over the place mentally.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and absolutely. I mean, this is the problem with, and this is also the problem with having too much pride. Like the point that I argue against is once your pride gets involved, you'll fight tooth and nail to maintain your habits. I agree with that to a
Yes.
degree, and I really agree with it in a couple of places. One is I have a friend who beat a very serious addiction to opiates, and my friend like went to many groups, and there's language that's like once an addict always an addict, and he like really rejected that because he's like no, I was an addict, I no longer am. And he believes that like that was a big difference in him getting clean, and he's had no stumbles, like no struggles. And that's not to say that that will be prescriptive for other people. It's just like this person, like his identity is so strongly like influenced by that identity decision to say, like, I'm not this anymore. Like, I do think there is an element where this is true, but there's also an element of caution in this where it's like, dude, you take too much pride in identity factors that have nothing to do with who you are, and it will lead you far astray in life.
Yeah.
Like, I think about when I was training for marathons, I had this runner's mentality, and it was very much like yours, but it became like all-consuming to where it's like, I'm a runner, I run long marathons, and I finished, I did a bunch of halves, and then I ran a full marathon, and I got to the end, and I was like, the existential dread started to creep in, where I'm like, why did I do this? Who cares about this? Who cares about me? What am I doing with my life?
Yes.
Where am I going?
Dude,
you know, like, dude, this
there.
is the kind of stuff that, like, we need to be careful with, like, making our identity about minor issues in our lives. And I think this is a big issue for people today. Like, they have, like, identity factors that are much smaller than their core identities.
Yes. We tend to be bigger than what we think of ourselves.
Yes.
Not in a prideful way, but just like we tend to have more depth and more to us as people than we give ourselves credit for. And so that's kind of something that he talks about. He gives these quotes, this list of quotes on page 35. And the next flow of thought that I had about this from, you know, what we just talked about to this then directly ties to having a growth mindset versus having a fixed mindset. If you're not familiar with those two kind of paradigms, having a fixed mindset means that you identify yourself as something and you think that you are that thing. So like an example that we use all the time that I use in my classroom is a lot of kids and a lot of people just say, I'm not a math person. I've never been good at math. I'm not a math person, right? And they kind of put that fixed mindset on themselves. Instead of a growth mindset is saying basically yet. It's saying like, well, I don't know how to do that yet, or I haven't been able to do that yet. Yeah. And it's giving yourself room for growth rather than saying like, I am this thing. And the flip side of that too, right? Instead of saying, oh, I'm not a math person, I'm dumb, is when we tell kids constantly, and when we tell adults for that matter, right? Oh, you're smart. You're this, you're that. And smart is a really good one in terms of education, right? If a kid has always heard that they are smart, the first time that they come to some problem or situation or project that they just suck at, they give up way faster than someone that's going to think that, oh, well, I just need to keep growing. I just need to keep learning, right? If they're not focused on the process, if they're focused on, I am smart, oh, well, if I don't get this thing is dumb, not me. I don't want to do it because that thing's dumb, right? It's the whole shift in mindset that I think a lot of people need to make, and I wish I had known about it a lot sooner because I definitely had a fixed mindset when I was younger and, you know, in my formative years, right? And I had that same sort of thing where I guess people had told me I was smart, and so I wasn't really resilient to a lot of things because if something was difficult for me, I just felt like, well, if it's difficult for me, either no one can do it, right? Like that's where the pride comes in. Well, if it's difficult for me and I've been told I'm smart this whole time, then no one must be able to do it. Or the other, you know, it just gets to a very toxic level if you have a fixed mindset. So that was something else that I thought about on page 35. I actually put this into my section of like, what am I going to do about it in terms of, I talk about it a lot in class and I've talked about it a lot, but I realized that I probably haven't talked about it in the last like, I don't know, couple weeks. So I probably need to do that in my classroom again and just remind them and have a little mini lesson, 10 to 15 minute conversation about growth mindset versus fixed mindset. It's something I want to do today. I got to do it today because we're going to spring break.
Dude, nice. Yeah, no, I think that's great. Like it does feel, the stuff that Clear is talking about in this book, and we've talked about this before, it does feel like a code to be cracked. Like almost like, oh, wow. Knowing this will change things for me. And I do think there is an element to this book where that's very true. It's just that like, and I think he's not hubristic as a writer. He's very self-reflective, very honest. I think he would make the same, he would agree probably with the pushback that we brought up about identity. Like, oh yeah, like these things are not identity, like they're not the most important identity factors about us. But the point still stands. He says like he closes out this chapter with, you have the power to change your beliefs about yourself. Your identity is not set in stone. You have a choice in every moment. Page 41.
Exactly.
And
that's that growth mindset.
Yes, exactly. And I really like the analogy he uses of an election, where he says, like, the elected party doesn't always win by a landslide. It's just that you have done those things more than other things. And I kind of like that perspective, like, especially when you think of something like working out. I was talking to two guys last night, had dinner with them and our wives, and like was looking at both of them thinking like, man, these guys work out. Like their physique is really like chiseled and everything. And I was asking them like, hey, so what do you do for workouts? And one guy is extremely regimented, has this like whole, he's like you, Weston. He's like, yeah. I know what I'm doing and I'm tuning up and 1% improving every day in my workout. The other guy is like, oh, no, I work out 15 minutes a day. And like, I'm like, 15 minutes a day? He's like, yeah, push-ups, pull-ups, I just do some body weight stuff every single day. Like, both are great and both are winning the battle, right? Like, the fact that my dude gets up, puts on workout shoes, and does the workout every day wins the battle, even if he's not 1% improving on his, bicep gains or whatever, like, or his, bench press. He is doing something that is like, this is what a healthy person does. Both of them have internalized this idea, like, I'm a healthy person, I'm a fit person. I have habits that form around that. And they look extremely different. One and both are good. I'm not saying one is better than the other. I'm saying that like both are winning the battle, and that's what matters.
I think you bring up a good point there in terms of like, that's why you need to figure it out for yourself, because there's no one size fits all to everyone, right? Like for example, with the whole workout example there, right? I have to do certain exercises that might accomplish the same thing, but might be slightly different or at a different intensity with my lower back, because when I was younger, I broke my L5. Not severely, but like I had a hairline fracture, so I couldn't do anything for like 3 months when I was 14. So, excuse me, felt like forever at the time. It felt like, weight of the world, whatever. But like, I still have issues with that a little bit. And when I was 18 in lacrosse, I tore my left labrum, so I still have some shoulder. Oh my gosh, I can't think of the word. Asymmetries.
Okay.
To where I need to be more careful with this shoulder and, making sure that I'm taking care of that, right? So I guess my point being is like, yes, it's super individual, right? And even though both those guys are doing different things, it's whatever's working for them. And like you said, win the battle in whatever way that you're winning the battle. Because really, we don't need to win the battle over anything else except ourselves.
Yeah. I mean, that's really true. I think it comes to this point of like this is something I talk about, in Christian circles a lot, is like the whole idea of like sinner mentality versus a saint mentality, right? Like, are you a sinner who is trying, or are you a saint who sometimes stumbles? Like, it makes a big difference how you see yourself. Yep. A huge difference in like what you allow into your life and the kind of behaviors you'll allow to continue. So like in both cases, you will make mistakes that feel in discord with your identity. But in one case, you're motivated not to do them again because they feel wrong for who you are. And in the other, you're just like, oh yeah, I mean, this is who I am, right? And it allows you to make excuses for bad behaviors that you could just as easily decide you're not going to have a part of anymore.
Yep. And this actually dovetails perfectly into another quote that I loved on page 36, where he says, progress requires unlearning right?
Yes.
We have to unlearn a lot of our habits and things that we've grown accustomed to and grown comfortable with in our life
Yeah.
to make progress. And I thought it was interesting that, like, I really like that phrase because something that you've heard me say, Jack, and something I use a lot is progress is not linear.
Right.
So
Yeah.
there's going to be times where you plateau or you get worse, right? Which connects back to in chapter 1 the valley of
Latent potential.
the valley or the plateau of latent potential, right? So it's
Yeah.
that whole concept. So yeah, I really liked that where we have to unlearn things before we can really make progress. Like sometimes it's better to take a step back. You can't always keep moving forward.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, well, and it points to a really important thing. This is my like, what am I going to do with this? For me, I realized, like I talked at the very beginning of this episode, I tried a goalless life. It wasn't, it did nothing for me this week because I need to like put micro behaviors into effect. I need to think about my identity. I need to think about like, okay, well, who am I? What am I doing? Where is that going to lead? And I need to deconstruct goals. I've been such a goal-setting person for so long that like one of the things that I have learned to do is put off accomplishing things till I set the goal. And there's like a goal-setting session where you sit down and you write out the new goal and then you start working on it. And the reality is like I need to unlearn that. Like this is my what do I do? I need to unlearn this process a little bit. I need to dig into identity and start thinking about how am I living the opposite direction? Okay, what do I want to be?
Mm-hmm.
Who am I trying to be? Where are we trying to go? And to think about this organizationally too, like I lead a church. Think about the church. Like what is this? What are we trying to be? Not where are we trying to get? Because that's so easy to do in an organization. But I know that this is true, that you can live out of core identity and do them. A key example in my life is leadership. Like people put the title of leader on other people. But the reality is every leader feels like a, unless you're like a total narcissist, I think, just personally. But every leader starts off feeling like a fraud. Like, me? Why should I lead? What do I have to lead or teach anybody, especially when you're young? But the reality is leaders lead. And like, if you're leading other people, you are a leader. And like, the more that you do that, the more you become that. And the better you get at that because you live out of this act of repeated beingness. So I know that it's true. I just need to unlearn some of those layers and get back to the center of like, okay, so what am I doing out of who I am, not where I'm trying to go.
That then takes us into chapter 3, which is about how to build better habits in 4 simple steps.
Always love the 4 simple steps.
Right,
I love
yeah,
a
there's
list.
always, 3 simple steps to this, 4 simple steps to that. But
7 sins to try today.
Yeah. I'm interested to try this process out that we're going to talk about here in this chapter. One of the things that stood out to me early on in the chapter was, let's see, page 44, so the second page of the chapter, where he talks about the cats learning how to do something, but they're getting it with an external reward, right? And so my thought about this was, this is why it's difficult to balance just within yourself, or if you're leading other people, it's difficult to balance intrinsic motivation with external rewards. I always strive to move my students towards intrinsic motivation and reward, but it is clear as day that from a young age, you have a young child right now, I have a young child that's kind of starting to understand the external rewards, right? From a very young age, we're just animals with external motivation driving our behaviors, especially as children. So it's really difficult. It's difficult to balance and then move towards more intrinsic motivation rather than external rewards. So that was something that stood out to me, like just right away when the chapter started.
Yeah, very first thing that stuck out to me was Mr. Thorndike and his cat box. Sounds like a punk band or like a Sherlock Holmes novel.
That's funny. Yeah.
Mr. Thorndyke and his box of cats.
Yeah. I
But
think
yes,
so.
exactly. Like the external reward is so it is what drives us. Like the habit loop that he brings up in this, working on the work of Charles Duhigg, the cue, craving, response, reward, and breaks it into two sections, right? So cue and craving, that's the problem phase. Response, reward, the solution phase. Our brain automates the process of solving problems and achieving success. And I like the simple examples he gives, like video games give us relief. We are stressed when we come home from work. That's our cue. The craving is I want relief, right, from the stress. The response is I pick up the video game controller. The reward is a dopamine rush from all of the colorful images as we're transported to a dream world of magic. You know, like this is our these are how habits form, and there's no denying it. And like as much as you might want to take away those things, you might want to take away the external reward, like you're talking about as a teacher, where you're like, I don't want to reward kids, or this is something I heard from my boss at one point in my life, where it was like, I'm not going to, reward people for doing their job. And I'm like, oh, but sir, you must reward people for doing their job. Otherwise, they won't do it.
Right.
If they don't get a reward, they're just going to stop doing it.
Yeah.
Because the only thing that keeps them going is their brain's need for dopamine.
Yeah. Or the other thought I had here is at the very least, there needs, or like it's either external rewards or external punishments, because we will do a lot to avoid external punishments as
That's
well. So if like at your job, right, if you're not getting punished for not doing something, why am I going to do it? I mean, if nothing's going to happen, then I don't really care, right?
Yeah. Well, this was an interesting thing and a pushback I initially had, but I think it might be intentional. He doesn't talk about punishment.
Right.
He talks only about reward.
Yes.
And I think maybe the reason he does that, even though I know punishment is effective, is I really don't think it's as effective.
Oh, no, I totally agree. It's not nearly as effective, but it's still something that's like just kind of in life and in there, because the thing that I think he's trying to get to with these habits and with the 1%, because you'll get 1% worse, if you don't do it. So if you don't immediately see the punishment, that punishment will be wrought. There will be a price to pay eventually, right? So just like with your health, it's like debt. It's like debt. If you continue to avoid making those payments towards your health, it's going to fall off a cliff at some point. Like the punishment will be harsh and severe.
Yes. I mean, this is one of the problems with kids, right?
Yeah.
They don't understand this at all.
Right.
That has to be taught to them. Like,
yep.
Well,
and there has to be natural consequences that show that to them.
This is why, like your toddler, it's okay to let them walk and fall, because better they fall on their face when they're, 2 and a foot off the ground than that they fall off a cliff when they're 8 and they've never done that before and they don't know that there's pain involved, right? Like
yes.
And this is one of the challenges of this can be, I think, sometimes a challenge of our society, that like there's such a fear of failure. Like all failure of any stripe is made out to be catastrophic.
Right.
And
when really that's the key. You have to fail to learn. You have to, I totally agree. I think the fear of failure, and that's kind of what we were talking about with chapter 2 in terms of, having that fixed mindset of like, oh my God, if I fail, I'm not living up to what I should be or what I've been told I am.
Yes.
And you have to unlearn that mindset and learn that failure is part of the process. Like we said a few minutes ago, progress is not linear. You are going to fail, but learning from those failures will help you progress more. And that's just it's such a difficult. The hard part is, and something I've struggled with as a relatively young father. I'm only 3 years into this. I struggle with where is the line between me trying to provide those natural consequences and me just letting life give those natural consequences, because I don't want to overly burden my child with. I think it's a hard line for me to distinguish between when am I being too harsh, when am I being too lenient. That's I think that's a balance that it's really hard to tightrope walk on as a parent. And
Yeah.
it's that's another learning process that I've definitely made mistakes. Like just last night, my son was testing boundaries like all kids do at bedtime, and I had said, "All right, bud," because trying to develop independence. I had given him, hey, all right, we need to take our clothes off, and we need to get our jammies on, so we're getting ready for bed. And he just started running around the room. I gave him one more stern warning. He was just like, ha 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 ha, right? Testing boundaries. I stop him. I make him look at me. I say, buddy, it's time for bed. Time to start getting ready. You need to do that, right? So it's like I had gone through these layers, and then eventually I think I took it. I think I took it a little too hard. I had to have a conversation with my wife afterwards.
Yeah.
Where it got to the point of after like 10 or so layers of what I was trying to do to get him on track,
Yeah.
I just grabbed him, put him on the ground, held him down, and did it. He was screaming the whole time. I knew it wasn't pleasant.
Yeah.
And there was at one point where I like yelled at him. I was like, "This is what happens when you don't listen to other people.
Yeah.
Like when you're not listening, right?" So I'm trying to teach a lesson, but it's like I know he's not learning anything from that because it's so harsh, and in the moment he's screaming. But it's one of those things where it's like I also need him, or I want him to understand that, like, I guess I might have been extrapolating it too far, which is another one of my struggles, where I tend to get too deep, or I tend to generalize, perhaps too soon, where I was viewing it, and I told my wife afterwards, after he was in bed, and we talked about it after, like, he needs to understand that people have limits, and if he pushes the wrong buttons, he will get smacked in the face in real life. I don't want him.
Yeah, like,
And I think the other thing with that is because my wife is also a teacher, I have seen so many behavior kids, and that's like one of my big fears is like I don't want my son to be a bad apple in a classroom where he's distracting other kids. He's the one that's getting everyone else off task and preventing others from learning and on their own path, right?
Yeah.
So I need him to understand, like sooner rather than later, that like don't fuck around, dude. Like once people have given you a couple warnings on something and they've shown you what their limits are, you better not test it. Or if you do test it, expect to get smacked. So
I that is a good point. Like, you don't want him to be exhibited to, like, your wrath is metered, right? You have a response you can control, and you love him, right? So, but you don't want it to be like, all right, listen, Mr. Thorndike will put you in the cat box, and you have to struggle to get out, right? Like that's the wrong. This is the problem of no consequence. No consequence living is like at some point life will slap you in the face, and it will be much better it's your parents than it's the law or something even worse like death or something like that, like, which is very much a consequence of living. And there is always that line, and I think this is why and there is a big move in parenting, and we know this from like reading parenting books a lot, of like positive thinking only, of like and the removal of punishment and stuff like that. I do think it is worthwhile for us to think about this cue response. What is it? Cue craving.
We need to dive into that
reward.
more because that's what the chapter's about. And
Yeah. I mean, it's like, how can we adjust? Because I do think that this is the more intuitive, like it's the biologically hardwired way of us learning new behaviors. So like, one of the problems I think that you bring up with punishment is like, one, like punishments are often overly harsh and like way too late for our brains to really make any connection between what's going on and what happened. Like, I see this with my dogs all the time. I want to punish them for doing things that they did when I was gone. And the reality is that does absolutely no good for anybody. There's no point. Like, you rub your dog's face in it when like they have like peed on the floor or something. They don't get it. Like they're so far removed from the behavior, they probably don't even remember if it was them or why they did it, or it's just like it's not hardwired. What they even like the worst thing is they start to associate you with punishment.
Exactly.
And like that's a bad way to lead.
Yeah. Well, and
this is like,
their intention was not to make you mad, right? It's not like the dog was intentionally. At least I don't know. In my experiences, I haven't had any dogs, malicious dogs.
Yeah,
And,
malicious.
I've heard stories actually of some dogs
Yeah.
that seem to be malicious, but like for the most part,
Yeah.
they're not trying to be. They're trying to be good little boys and good little girls, right?
Yeah.
And the same applies to children. They're trying to be good little boys and good little girls.
Yeah. Well, and the same applies to us too. Like we're just like what people are trying to do when they start to develop bad habits is they're feeding this cue craving response reward mechanism in their brain. The thing is, like a kid who acts out, for instance, in class, like the cue is, this feels bad. I feel either like I don't understand what's going on at school. Nobody's looking at me. I'm not getting attention, whatever. That's the cue. It feels bad. So the craving is like, I want attention. The response is, I'm going to scream because people will look at me if I scream. And then that feels good. Like, oh, people are paying attention to me, which doesn't happen at home. Like
it's crazy seeing that so often in schools where bad behaviors are a lot of times, especially with the younger ones, like 6, 7, 8-year-olds. It's most of the time just attention seeking because they just want more attention. And they'll do just exactly what you're saying. They will throw chairs, they'll punch other kids just so that someone looks at them because they just want to be seen.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, that's so huge. So one of the things that really stuck out to me from this chapter, here's a quote. Maybe it's a learning, maybe it's pushback. I'm not entirely sure. But the primary reason the brain remembers the past is to predict what will work in the future. This is page 46. That's a loaded statement. I think that, like, I love it. Like, why does the brain remember the past? So it can predict what happens better in the future. I wonder if it's that reductionistic, right? Like, maybe there are other benefits for remembering the past, such as, like, remembering what doesn't work from the past, not just knowing what will work in the future.
Yeah.
But it is interesting how much learning Clear talks about us doing. Like, we don't often think about the minor things we do as learned. We think of them as just developed or innate. And I think it is really important for us to consider like how every behavior is learned, even our small ones.
I agree. On that same page, I took a note that I love the concept of the habits creating freedom, kind of like what we talked about a little bit ago, and not destroying freedom, right? You don't want to. It is kind of interesting, and kind of going back a little bit to page 45, where he talks about the like automating of processes, where as you get something into a habit, it just becomes automatic, and you don't even have to think about it, right? I took a note on that too, and I said that's why, I don't know if you've had this experience in jobs, but annual evaluations have grown more annoying for me as I've gotten deeper into my career, because the need to repeatedly explain myself every year, like why my response to this situation happened. There's been a lot of things that I've just automated from experience, and I'm like, I don't remember why I do this, but I know that it's the best way to do it based on my experience because I've forgotten the reasons why, right? I just know that it's the best answer that I've learned so far to this particular problem.
Yeah.
And so that's something it's kind of interesting because I have seen that with my life where I just, as soon as I get into a real habit with something, it's just automatic. I automate it. Yeah. I don't have to think of it anymore, and that creates freedom. It creates space in my brain to learn new things, right? And I said that as a man who, as a man who is somewhat obsessed with efficiency, and I'm working on that, I completely agree with that idea of just the automatizing, I don't think that's the right word, but of automating of your habits and of your processes.
Yeah.
I did have a slight disagreement also on page 46. If you had anything,
Okay. Yeah, no,
so
go for it. What is it?
this is kind of interesting. The quote on page 46 is, habit formation is incredibly useful because the conscious mind is the bottleneck of the brain. It can only pay attention to one problem at a time. And when I read this, I literally slapped my hand down on the table and I said, can someone please say that to my wife? Because I think, I don't know, I've read some studies that maybe this is a male-female thing. I don't know if I
Yeah.
agree with that, but it's like, the people that say that they multitask annoy
Yeah.
the hell out of me because I know that I cannot. And it's hard for me to believe it, you know? It's one of those things that I'm just like, no, I think you're just doing a few things pretty I don't think you're doing one thing great, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
So I put a little note there. It's like, I get tired of, you know, my wife, coworkers, other people trying to explain how they're so good at multitasking. And I just always call bullshit on that. I'm like, that's not my experience. That is not. So it's more of a disagreement with other people because I hard
Yeah.
agree with what he said, but I wish so
Sure,
many
sure,
people
sure, sure.
didn't think
Yeah,
that way
yeah.
about themselves or say, oh yeah, I'm so good at multitasking.
I have described this like in our own house. I have a whatting problem. Like Lindsay will, my wife will speak to me, and she will say like she'll just be speaking to me, and I'll go what, and she'll like stare at me. I'm like what did you say? And
Yeah,
she'll be
yeah,
like okay, but I'll do this like 100 times. Like it's so unproductive and like it's very bad. It's a problem. But I have started describing it as like, listen, what I'm doing is I'm task switching. I like you can't see this, but my brain is engaged in something else.
yes,
Like whatever it is engaged in like something I'm working on or some problem from my day, and then like uh, that like the external audio interrupts that internal thought process and redirects it, and like the what is the like task switch. And I think that I definitely think there's something biological to that. And maybe there's a slight difference between men and women, but like the reality is definitely there. Like your brain just can't do much.
dude. I've
Can't
had
do
so
much at the
many.
same time.
Yeah, I've had so many conversations with my wife of just like I've just told her like the solution to this problem is you need to like tap me on the shoulder or make sure that I'm listening because like
Yeah,
you might have this experience. I'm maybe on the couch or doing something with my son in the living room, and then she'll like yell from another room,
yeah,
and I'll be like, I wasn't like actively listening to you. What did you say? Right? Like I have no
yeah, yeah,
idea. And then she's
yeah,
like, I can't believe you didn't hear me or something like that. And I'm like, you didn't get my attention first, right?
yeah.
Like, and
Well, and
I try and tell her because she's a teacher, right? I'm like,
yeah,
as a teacher, I know that best practices are I need an attention getter so that the
yeah,
students are looking at me and not talking amongst themselves before I say anything. If I just
right.
say something to the crowd without getting their attention first, no one's going to know what I said. And the same
Yeah,
thing applies to me, where I'm just like, you need to at least make sure that my focus is on you before you say something important that you want me to hear, right?
yeah,
If
yeah.
you just
And
want to get
this
it out and
like
don't care about me hearing it, and by all means, go ahead. But
well, and this is an area I want to be fair to my wife too, because here's the thing: is like she's fully focused on me. She's like thinking about this conversation that we're having and these things she's asking me,
right,
and my brain is elsewhere. And
yeah,
like so, like like she like the thing is like when that happens, I have to realize like oh her attention is on me, and like
yes,
I need to shift my attention to her. Like that's the challenge. And I think that can be misinterpreted as like, oh, women are better multitaskers, but I don't think that's it. I think when that happens in our households, it's like she's giving you full attention. You should give her that full attention. Like that's the thing that I'm trying to work through on my own. You know,
yeah, yeah.
it's like,
And like you said, to give like I'm not, yeah, like we're not trying to, you know, degrade women. I think it's just they think differently. And in my
yeah,
experience, again, I don't have a female brain. I think it's they're able to do that switch faster.
maybe,
They're able to make connections faster to be like, oh, okay, I was thinking about the bathroom, which then led me to think about the cleaning products that we need to buy, which then led me to think about, well, what are the groceries that we need to get this weekend? And they just do that like really quickly. Whereas
mm,
like I'm still on like, well, wait, how are we going to do that one thing? Like I'm thinking,
yeah, yeah,
I feel like in my mind I'm thinking deeper about this one thing, whereas they tend to do that switching more often and quicker.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm also always just somewhere else. It's like that classic meme where you see like the man and the woman in bed, and the woman is like, is he thinking about other girls? And like the guy is like,
those are so true.
The guy is like, how can I take apart my motorcycle?
Yeah.
Or like whatever.
Yeah. Or like, dude, what if T-Rexes had longer arms? Like that's so true for me. Like I'm never thinking about like, I totally agree.
Yeah. It's always some stupid thing.
Yeah.
Like.
Yeah, like yesterday, dude, here's a perfect example. Yesterday we're going to pick up my son from daycare. We get out of the car and we're just waiting for them to bring my son out to us. And I turn to my wife and I say, "Hun, okay, so during my break today I was doing some research. Who do you think the least valuable player in the NBA was this season?" And she's like, "What? Why, like, what?" And I spent a good, 15 minutes researching this topic.
Yeah.
And so I'm like excited to tell her because I found this guy that I'd never heard of that I was like, oh, he's definitely like, oh, if you look at his like net rating and everything, like I had all these stats, and she's just like, what are you even talking about? It was like a perfect example.
I could not care less about this topic.
Yeah, exactly, right? She's like thinking about our son and how his day was at school or at daycare, and
yeah, totally.
Yeah.
You're like. Yeah, that's definitely something I do all the time. Where I'm like, yeah, guess what the top 7 sins of 2018 were? I read 5 articles on it.
Yeah. What are the best 5 songs that Modest Mouse has ever made, Hun?
Yeah.
Now.
Yeah.
I have my list ready. You don't? What?
Yeah. Do you know what the most viewed commercial was in the 90s? Because I just learned that today.
Wait, let me take a guess.
And then I'm thinking about all of my... No.
Oh, you don't know? I was going to say...
I don't actually know.
I was going to say it was either What's Up, the Budweiser commercial, or Where's the Beef? But that might have been late 80s.
Yeah, I think Where's the Beef is... I think that's earlier. I definitely think What's Up has to be it.
Anyways, we digress.
We're so far off topic here.
Yeah.
But here's what the question is, okay, what do we do with this? Here's my thought. Solving problems. Like, if the brain is solving problems, how can we circumvent that issue? And I think that's, like, Clear is certainly going there with his how to create good habits, break bad habits, with his 4 laws. And this is the end of these conversations. Or this is the end of this chapter because this is what goes on in the next chapters. But he says, creating good habits, make it obvious, attractive, easy, satisfying. Breaking bad habits, invisible, unattractive, difficult, unsatisfying. These are, this is what I was thinking about in terms of problem solving. So if I'm thinking, what am I going to do with this? I'm going to start thinking very simply, before even getting into these 4 laws of behavior change, thinking, okay, like when I'm doing something I don't like or something I want to do, I want to think about like, okay, well, what's the problem my brain is going to be solving there? Like, how can I circumvent that sort of thinking, right? So, doom scrolling, right? Picking up the phone, just scrolling endlessly. How can you circumvent that? What's the problem? Well, the problem is like you need immediate relief from something, stressor, boredom, whatever. Like when I start to recognize myself doing this habit, to think, oh, my brain is solving a problem right now. Where is the problem? Like follow it back, That's something I've been thinking about. This is this is an application from this chapter to me. It's very simple.
Yeah, I think an application for me was I want to start using the cue, craving, response, reward, or at least like I want to kind of take a note on one of my habits and just see if I can identify those things within that habit that I have, and then see if I should change anything within that habit. Like ideally, I want to try and do it to a bad habit I have. Mm-hmm. But I mean, the truth is I'm perfect and don't have any bad habits. So
right, yeah.
I don't know what I would even do it to. I mean, but no, I think I want to like put this frame onto one of my habits and analyze it and see where it brings me. So that's what I want to do. And I'm very interested to see, because now the next the next few chapters, and really the rest of the book, is diving into cue, craving, response, reward. So I'm very excited to read the rest.
Yeah, me too. Looking forward to thinking good about it.
Yeah,
That's for sure, with our book friends.
absolutely.
Thank you for joining us, book friends. Next week on the BFTTG pod, Jack and Weston, they're thinking good some more with you, our book friends. Check out the show notes or the description, comment section for a link to the book and any articles that we talk about in the show. Bye-bye, book friends.
Bye for this time, guys.
Do a good thing today.
I love you.
Love you too, dude.